This, right here, is not just another moment. Something is different. You can feel it, but you can't fully explain it. It's like a subtle shift beneath everything, a quiet realignment happening without permission, without warning. And the strange part is, nothing on the outside had to change for this to begin. Because this moment was never triggered by the world around you, it was activated from within you. There is a precise point in your timeline where your old pattern loses its grip, where the version of you that kept repeating the same cycles quietly disconnects. Most people miss it. They keep looking for something dramatic, something obvious. But the real shift happens silently. And if you're hearing this right now, you didn't just find this moment, you aligned with it. This is the exact point where everything begins to move differently, and once it does, there is no return to who you were before. 1. The point where your old pattern lost control. What resulted lost control? There is something no one ever tells you about the patterns that run your life. They don't feel like patterns. They feel like reality. They feel like the truth. They feel like the natural order of things. The way your mornings unfold, the way your relationships move, the way opportunity either finds you or consistently seems to pass just slightly beyond your reach. You don't experience these as repeating loops. You experience them as life, as a circumstance, as the particular flavor of existence that simply belongs to you. But here is what's actually happening beneath all of that. Every pattern that governs your life, every cycle that keeps returning, every emotional response that fires before you've even finished thinking, every self-sabotage that emerges precisely when things are starting to go well, none of it was chosen consciously. None of it was designed by the thinking, aware, present version of you. It was installed quietly, deeply, at a time when you had no ability to filter what was coming in and what should be rejected. Before the age of roughly 7 years old, your brain operates predominantly in what scientists call a theta brainwave state. This is the same state that hypnotherapists artificially induce in adults during deep trance work. In theta, the critical, analytical mind, the part of you that evaluates information, questions what it's being told, and decides whether something is true, hasn't fully formed yet. Which means everything that entered your consciousness during those early years entered without resistance, without evaluation, without any version of you standing at the door saying, wait, is this actually true? Your parents' fears became your fears. Their limitations became your perceived ceiling. Their relationship with money, with love, with success, with safety, all of it poured directly into the deepest layers of your subconscious mind like water into unguarded soil. And it took root there, not as beliefs you chose, as beliefs that felt like facts. Then something remarkable happened, which is also something quietly devastating. You grew up, your conscious mind developed. You started forming opinions, making choices, pursuing goals. You started wanting things that were different from the environment that shaped you. And this is where the war begins, the invisible war that most people spend their entire lives fighting without ever knowing what they're actually fighting against. Because the conscious mind, the part of you reading these words, the part of you with dreams and plans and intentions, processes approximately 40 bits of information per second. 40. It sounds significant, until you learn that the subconscious mind processes approximately 40 million bits of information per second. The ratio isn't even a competition. The subconscious doesn't just influence your behavior, it dominates it, it runs. It is the operating system, and the conscious mind is just the application sitting on top, believing it's in charge. This is why willpower fails. Not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline or intelligence or commitment, but because willpower is a conscious mind tool being applied to a subconscious mind problem. It's like trying to override the autopilot on a plane by politely asking the computer to reconsider. The computer doesn't negotiate, it executes its programming. So what is your programming actually running? For most people, and this is the part that requires a moment of honest stillness, the core programs are some version of these: I am not quite enough. The world is unpredictable, and fundamentally unsafe. Good things require enormous suffering to earn. Success invites attack. I will eventually be abandoned. Love comes with conditions I might not be able to meet. I have to stay small to stay protected. You may not hear those phrases consciously. You may not walk around thinking about them. But watch your behavior. Watch the moments you pull back just as something is expanding. Watch the relationships that always seem to recreate the same fundamental dynamic. Watch how your body responds to the possibility of something genuinely sustainably good. There's often a subtle tightening, a quiet waiting for the other shoe to drop, a part of you that doesn't quite trust it, doesn't quite let it fully in. That is the pattern, running itself, invisible and automatic. But here is the precise moment that everything begins to change. And this is not metaphor, this is neurological and quantum reality converging on a single point. There comes a moment in a person's life. Sometimes it's a dramatic event, sometimes it's the quietest, ordinary Tuesday you've ever experienced, where something in the system stops cooperating with its own programming, where the pattern suddenly becomes visible to the person living inside it, not as a distant intellectual concept, as a direct, undeniable, felt recognition. This is the loop. I've been here before, not in this exact form, but in this exact feeling. And I've been here before that, and before that. That recognition, that moment of genuine seeing, is not small. That moment is everything, because a pattern cannot survive being truly seen. Not completely, not the way the deepest part of you is capable of seeing it. When you observe something from the level of pure awareness rather than from within the pattern itself, you have fundamentally altered your relationship to it. You are no longer inside it, looking through it at the world. You are outside it, looking at it as a thing, a constructed thing, an installed thing, a thing that was never who you actually are. And in that moment of genuine observation, the pattern loses its primary power source. It loses you. Because patterns don't run on their own. They run on unconscious participation. They require you to keep reacting automatically, keep interpreting the world through their filter, keep feeding them the emotional energy that proves they're real. The moment your awareness steps fully outside the loop begins to dissolve. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. This is where you are right now, not at the beginning of the dissolution. That's been happening for longer than you realize. But at the moment of conscious recognition, at the moment where the part of you that knows finally rises fully above the part of you that was programmed and says, with quiet, unshakable certainty, not this time. The old pattern has not just weakened, it has reached its terminal point, the point where it no longer has enough unconscious agreement to sustain itself, the point where reality has begun to reorganize around the emerging version of you rather than the installed version. You didn't force this moment. You can't. Forcing is the old pattern's energy. Strain, effort, control, trying to push the river. This moment arrived because a deeper intelligence in you, the intelligence that has been watching, waiting, slowly dismantling the architecture of limitation one quiet piece at a time, reached a threshold. And at threshold, everything reorganizes. The old pattern didn't lose control violently. It lost control the way ice loses its structure as temperature slowly rises, gradually, then suddenly, then completely. One moment it's solid, then it's something altogether different. You are in the altogether different now. 2. The invisible rewiring you didn't notice. Something has been happening inside you that you weren't fully aware of, not recently, not since some dramatic turning point you can point to and name. This process has been underway for far longer than your conscious timeline suggests, and the reason you didn't notice it happening in real time is precisely the same reason that the most important biological processes in your body operate below the threshold of your awareness. Because the deepest transformations do not announce themselves. They simply proceed. Let's talk about what neuroplasticity actually means at the level of lived experience, because the word has been used so casually so often that it's lost its staggering implications. Your brain is not fixed. This was the dominant assumption of neuroscience for most of the 20th century, that after a certain critical developmental window, the brain's fundamental architecture was essentially locked in. The neurons you had were the neurons you'd work with. The connections that formed in childhood were the connections that largely defined you. Change was possible at the edges, perhaps, but the core structure, immutable. That assumption was wrong. Profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Neurons that fire together wire together. This is perhaps the most important sentence in all of modern neuroscience, and it has implications that most people never fully absorb. Every single time you think a thought, feel an emotion, or engage in a behavior, specific groups of neurons activate simultaneously. And every time they activate together, the connection between them strengthens. Myelin, a fatty white substance that acts like insulation around nerve fibers, wraps more thickly around the neural pathways that get used repeatedly. More myelin means faster signal transmission, which means more automatic, more effortless, more default behavior becomes. This is why habits feel effortless after a certain point. This is why emotional reactions happen faster than thought. The pathway has been myelinated to the point where the signal moves at near lightning speed, bypassing the slower deliberative processes entirely. But here is the other side of that equation, the side that changes everything. Neurons that no longer fire together begin to lose their connection. The pathway doesn't disappear immediately, but without regular activation, the myelin thins, the signal slows, the automatic, effortless quality of the old response begins to degrade, and simultaneously new pathways, the ones being activated by new thoughts, new emotional responses, new behaviors, new ways of interpreting experience, begin to thicken and strengthen. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal physical reorganization of your brain's architecture, and it has been happening to you, without your full conscious awareness, without permission, without effort in the conventional sense of that word, because something in you, call it intuition, call it the soul's intelligence, call it the deeper mind that operates below language, began quietly refusing to activate the old pathways with the same unconscious reliability, began introducing tiny hesitations, tiny questions, tiny moments of wait, is this actually what I want to do here? Between the trigger and the automatic response, those tiny hesitations are everything, because in the gap between stimulus and response, something lives that changes the entire equation. Viktor Frankl famously spoke of this, the space between stimulus and response where freedom lives. But what he couldn't have known in his time is that this is also the space where neurological rewiring occurs. Every time you inhabit that gap, even for a fraction of a second longer than you used to, you are weakening the old neural superhighway and laying the first gravel of a new road. You have been doing this more than you know, more than you can see from inside the experience. Think about the thoughts that no longer feel as true as they once did. There used to be certain inner voices, certain narratives about who you are, what you're capable of, what you deserve, how the world works, that felt unquestionable, solid, like facts you'd simply have to arrange your life around. And now, something is different about them. They still show up, perhaps, but they show up with less authority, less certainty, less of the crushing emotional weight that used to make them feel like the final word on reality. That shift in the felt quality of a thought, from unquestionable truth to just a thought, just an old program running, is not nothing. That is the evidence of rewiring in lived experience. The pathway is thinning, the signal is slowing, the old certainty is losing its neurological infrastructure, and simultaneously, though it can be harder to notice because new things feel less dramatic than dying old things, there have been new thoughts arriving with increasing ease and increasing resonance. Thoughts that feel more like you, more like the version of you that exists ahead of all this. Thoughts about possibility, about identity, about what's actually available in this life when you're no longer operating from installed limitations. These thoughts used to feel effortful, foreign, like they required active construction and constant defense against the old programming that would immediately move to dismiss them. Now, they arrive more naturally. Stay longer. It feels more like home. That is also rewiring. New pathways forming, new defaults establishing themselves. The neurological landscape quietly reorganizes around a different center of gravity. There is something else happening simultaneously that operates at an even more fundamental level than the neurological, something that modern quantum biology is only beginning to understand. The cells of your body are not passive containers for your consciousness. They participate in it. Every cell in your body contains the full genetic code of your entire organism, and the expression of that code, which genes are switched on, which are switched off, which proteins are being produced, which cellular behaviors are being enacted, is responsive to the chemical environment the cell is swimming in. And the chemical environment of your cells is created substantially by your emotional state. When you exist in chronic states of fear, threat, scarcity, and stress, the emotional signature of the old pattern, your body bathes your cells in stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, the chemical cocktail of emergency. And in that environment, cells shift resources away from growth, maintenance, and regeneration, redirecting everything toward immediate survival. This is brilliant when you're facing an actual physical threat. It is quietly catastrophic when it's your baseline operating state, when the emergency is not a predator but a belief system. But when your emotional state shifts, when you begin spending more time in states of possibility, openness, genuine curiosity, and the quiet excitement of an expanding future, the chemistry changes. Different signals reach the cells, different genes express. The body begins to operate in a fundamentally different mode. This is not spiritual language dressed in scientific clothing. This is the emerging field of epigenetics documenting that your emotional state directly influences genetic expression in measurable, observable ways. Your beliefs literally change your biology, not eventually, not metaphorically. Now, in real time, at the cellular level, the rewiring you didn't notice was never just neurological, it was biological, it was cellular. It was the invisible reformation of who you are at every level of your physical existence, reorganizing around the new frequency you've been increasingly inhabiting, even in those moments when you thought nothing was changing, when the old pattern still felt so dominant, when you wondered whether any of this was real. It was real. It was happening. Every single time you chose differently, even imperfectly, even momentarily, even when you fell back into the old pattern 2 hours later, you were contributing to a rewiring that has been accumulating beneath the surface, compounding silently, building toward the threshold that is now unmistakably here. The invisible rewiring is no longer entirely invisible. You can feel it in the way certain old triggers no longer produce the same response, in the way certain old relationships no longer feel comfortable in the way they once did, in the way certain old environments seem to jar against something in you that has quietly changed its frequency. In this way, your relationship to your own future has shifted from something you were anxiously trying to control to something that feels more like a living thing you're in a genuine relationship with. You didn't force this rewiring. You couldn't have. The deepest neurological and biological transformation operates on its own intelligence, its own timeline. You simply had to keep showing up to the process, keep choosing, however imperfectly, to inhabit a slightly different way of being. And the system did the rest. The rest is done, or rather, it has reached the point of irreversibility. The new architecture has sufficient strength that it is now self-sustaining. The new pathways are thick enough that they have begun to feel natural. The old pathways have thinned enough that returning to them now requires actual effort, the kind of conscious, deliberate, uncomfortable effort that is very hard to sustain. Which means the old you, the patterned, programmed, cycling version, now lives on the difficult side of the equation. The new version is the path of least resistance now. 3. Why nothing around you had to change. This is the part that most people find the most difficult to accept. Not because it's complicated, because it directly contradicts something so deeply embedded in the way we've been taught to think about reality, about causation, about how change happens, that accepting it requires a kind of mental flexibility that feels almost physically uncomfortable at first. Here it is, the shift that is happening, the profound, real, irreversible transformation of your experience of being alive did not require and does not require anything in your external circumstances to change first. Not your relationship, not your financial situation, not your job, not your health, not the behavior of the people around you, not the political climate, not the economy, not your past, not the structural conditions of your life as they currently exist. Nothing outside of you needed to move for this to begin, and that is not a comforting platitude. It is a precise, verifiable statement about the nature of reality and the direction of causation in human experience. We have been trained, by culture, by education, by the stories we've been told about how life works, to understand causation as moving in one direction. The world happens to us. External events produce internal experiences, circumstances create feelings, things change on the outside, and then we feel different on the inside. This is the model most people operate from without ever questioning it, because it appears to be confirmed by daily experience at every turn. But here is what's actually happening. Your nervous system does not experience reality directly. It experiences a model of reality, a constructed, interpreted, filtered version of what's out there, built by the brain from incoming sensory data that is then processed through every prior experience, belief, expectation, and emotional state you carry. What you perceive as objective external reality is, in the most literal neurological sense, a simulation, your brain's best guess at what's out there, assembled and projected from the inside. This is not philosophy. This is neuroscience. The visual cortex, for example, does not passively receive images from the eyes. It actively generates predictions about what should be out there based on prior experience, and then uses incoming data to correct those predictions where they diverge from what's actually arriving at the retina. You are, at every moment, projecting a model of reality and then checking it against incoming data, not the other way around. The projection comes first, which means your internal state is not simply responding to external reality, it is substantially constructing your experience of external reality. The external world provides the raw material, your internal state provides the interpretive framework, and the interpretive framework shapes everything. What you notice, what you ignore, what feels possible, what feels threatening, what opportunities are visible to you, and what opportunities are simply invisible because your current filter has no template for recognizing them. Two people can stand in the exact same external circumstances and have completely different experiences of those circumstances, not because they're lying about their experience, not because one of them is being irrational, but because they are running different internal models of reality, and those models are constructing different versions of the same raw external input. This is not a small point. This changes everything about where you should be looking when you want your life to change. If you want different external results, and you do, real tangible external results, not just a better attitude about bad circumstances, the most efficient, most direct, most reliable path to those results is not to try to manipulate the external circumstances first. It is to change the internal model from which you're constructing your experience of reality. Because the external reality you consistently experience is downstream of your internal model, always, without exception. This is what the quantum physics of consciousness is pointing toward, cautiously, with appropriate scientific rigor, when it describes the role of the observer in determining what is observed. At the quantum level, particles exist in superposition, in a field of multiple simultaneous possibilities, until they are observed. The act of observation collapses the wave function, The observer's engagement with the quantum field participates in determining which of the many possible states becomes the actual, measurable state. Now, there is significant debate about how far this quantum observation effect scales up from the subatomic level to the macro level of human experience. Responsible thinkers acknowledge this, but what is not debatable, what is confirmed by decades of research in psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and even economics, is the macro-level version of the same principle, that the state of the observer substantially shapes what the observer observes and what possibilities become available to them in their lived experience. This shows up in research on confirmation bias, the well-documented tendency for people to notice, remember, and weigh evidence that confirms their existing beliefs and discount or fail to notice evidence that contradicts those beliefs. This isn't a character flaw. It's a feature of the perceptual system, a necessary efficiency that prevents cognitive overload. But its implication is profound. Whatever you believe is true about your life, your capacity, and what's available to you, the world will largely appear to confirm, not because the universe is conspiring with your beliefs, but because your perceptual system is highly selective, and it selects for what matches the model, which means that as your internal model shifts, as the old beliefs about scarcity, limitation, and threat lose their grip, and new beliefs about possibility, expansion, and capacity take root, you will begin noticing different things in the same world, not because different things have arrived, because your filter has changed, and a changed filter in the same environment produces a different experience of that environment so consistently, so reliably, that from the inside it can genuinely feel like the world itself has changed. And then something else happens, something that moves beyond the perceptual into the behavioral and social. Because your behavior changes when your internal model changes. The way you carry yourself changes, the words you choose change, the opportunities you pursue or decline change, the risks you're willing to take change, the relationships you invest in and the ones you quietly allow to dissolve change. And behavior change in a social world creates genuine external feedback that is different from the feedback the old behavior created. This is not magical. This is cause and effect. Just cause and effect operating from the inside out rather than the outside in, which is the direction most people never think to look. You have been waiting for the external circumstances to change before you allow yourself to feel different. This is the oldest trap in human psychology, the conditional happiness loop. I'll feel secure when I have enough money. I'll feel worthy when I achieve enough. I'll feel loved when I find the right person. I'll feel confident when I've accumulated enough proof. But the feelings are the signal that updates the model, and the model has to update before the system recalibrates what it's creating. Waiting for the external to change first is waiting for the solution to appear before you've created the conditions that make the solution possible. What has shifted in you, the core of this entire transformation, is the abandonment of that waiting, not through force or positive thinking, or willing yourself to pretend you feel differently, but through the genuine recognition that the internal state is not the reward for external change, it is the precondition for it, and that you are capable of accessing that internal state right now, in these circumstances, with this history, in this body, in this life. Nothing outside had to change for this to begin, and because it began, everything outside will eventually reflect it. Not as magic, as a consequence. 4. The exact moment your timeline split. There is a precise moment, and it is not metaphorical, not approximate, not a range of time spread across months of gradual development. There is a specific, identifiable, singular moment where your timeline diverged from what it was on its way to becoming. Most people never identify this moment while they're living it. They recognize it only in retrospect, sometimes years later, when they look back and can trace the thread of everything that followed to a single point of departure that felt at the time like anything other than what it actually was. It may have felt like a random thought that appeared unbidden, a conversation that took an unexpected turn, a book someone handed them, or a video they watched at 2 in the morning for reasons they can't fully explain. A moment of sitting quietly that suddenly broke open into something vast and wordless and undeniably real. The content of the moment is almost irrelevant. What matters is what happened inside it. In quantum mechanics, there is a principle, controversial in its macro-level implications but mathematically robust at the quantum scale, called the many worlds interpretation. Proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, it suggests that at every quantum decision point, every moment when a particle's state is uncertain until observed, reality doesn't simply choose one outcome, it branches. Every possible outcome occurs in a corresponding branch of reality. The universe, in this interpretation, is not a single linear story but an endlessly branching tree of simultaneous realities, each as real as the others. Now, whatever you believe about the literal truth of many worlds at the scale of human experience, there is something undeniably useful in this framework as a description of possibility in your personal timeline. Because at every significant decision point, every moment where you could go one direction or another, become one thing or another, engage with life one way or another, you are effectively choosing which branch of your possible future to inhabit. Most of these decision points happen so automatically, so unconsciously, that they don't feel like choices at all. They feel like the only obvious thing to do, which is of course the old pattern operating at full efficiency, ensuring that you continue to walk the familiar branch, continue to inhabit the familiar timeline, continue to produce the familiar results. But there are moments, rarer, more significant, and not always recognized in real time, when the decision point becomes genuinely conscious, when you become aware of the fork, when some part of you rises into sufficient clarity to see both branches simultaneously and to feel, with unusual precision, the difference between what lies down the familiar path and what lies down the one that requires something different from you. Your timeline split at one of these moments. And the reason it split permanently rather than temporarily, the reason it didn't just bend slightly and then curve back to the familiar path the way most such moments do, is that something about your internal state had reached a critical threshold just before that moment arrived. Thresholds are interesting things. We tend to experience change as gradual, a slow accumulation of small shifts that compounds over time. And in one sense, this is accurate. But the experience of change is often not gradual. The experience of change is often suddenly discontinuous, a long period of apparent sameness followed by an abrupt, dramatic reorganization into something clearly, unmistakably different. This is the physics of phase transitions. Water doesn't gradually become ice. It remains liquid, slightly colder but still fundamentally liquid, until it hits 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, at that threshold, the molecular structure reorganizes completely. One moment, liquid, one moment later, and this transition can happen within a fraction of a degree, ice, the same H2O, reorganized into a fundamentally different state. The change looked sudden, but it was prepared by every single degree of cooling that preceded the threshold. Your life has been accumulating degrees, every moment of genuine questioning. Every moment of sitting with discomfort rather than immediately numbing it. Every moment of choosing honesty over comfort, awareness over avoidance, curiosity over defensive certainty. Every small act of expanding slightly beyond the edge of what felt safe. Every time you felt the fear and moved gently in its direction rather than immediately away from it. Every insight that landed and stayed, rather than being immediately rationalized away by the old programming. These were degrees of cooling. They were invisible changes accumulating in the background, preparing the system for a reorganization that would feel sudden when it came but was actually the inevitable result of everything that preceded it. And then the moment came. The threshold was reached, and your timeline didn't just bend. It reorganized, the version of your future that was on its way before that moment. The extension of the old pattern, the continuation of the familiar loop, that future still exists as a possibility in the abstract. The branch is still there, but you are no longer on a trajectory toward it. The momentum has shifted, the direction has changed, And direction changes that happen at genuine threshold moments have an entirely different quality than the smaller, more temporary directional shifts that characterize ordinary choice. They have the quality of irreversibility, not because the old branch has ceased to exist, but because the version of you that would choose to walk it, the you that found the old pattern familiar, comfortable and home, has undergone sufficient transformation that the old branch no longer feels like home. It feels like a past life, like a costume that used to fit, like a story you can remember but can no longer fully inhabit because you've already stepped too far into a different story. The timeline split has happened. You are already walking the new branch. What remains is not the question of whether to continue. You are continuing inevitably because this is now your trajectory, but the question of how consciously you choose to inhabit this new direction, and conscious inhabitation of the new direction accelerates it enormously. Because the new timeline feeds on awareness, it grows stronger when you acknowledge it, recognize it, choose to act from it deliberately rather than falling into it accidentally. Every conscious choice that aligns with the person you are becoming on this new branch reinforces the trajectory, deepens the path, makes the return to the old branch require ever-increasing effort until, eventually, return becomes effectively impossible. You are past the split point. The fork is behind you now. What's ahead is the full inhabitation of the branch you've already chosen, even before you fully understood what you were choosing. 5. The disconnection from your former identity. Something is becoming visible to you that has always been true but was never quite this clear before. The person you've been calling you, the one with the specific history, the particular set of fears and defenses and desires, the one who showed up in relationships and situations in recognizable, predictable ways, the one who carried certain stories about what was possible and what wasn't. That person was never quite who you actually are. That person was who you learned to be. And there is a profound, significant, uncomfortable, and liberating difference between those two things. Identity, the self we experience as the most intimate, most real, most fundamentally us thing in our existence, is not something we arrive with fully formed. It is something we construct, mostly in childhood, mostly without awareness, from the raw material of experience, environment, relationship, and the meaning-making apparatus of a developing mind that does not yet have the sophistication to question what it's building. The philosopher and developmental psychologist Robert Kegan described human development as the lifelong process of progressively becoming able to stand outside what was previously our framework of identity, moving from being embedded in a structure to being able to look at it. In childhood, we are entirely embedded in our family system. We don't have a family system, we are the family system. We can't see it because we're inside it. As we develop, we gain the capacity to step back and observe it. Then we become embedded in our peer group, our cultural identity, our ideological framework. And gradually, with growth and courage and the right conditions, we gain the capacity to observe those as well, to hold them rather than be held by them. But for most people, this developmental process stalls somewhere in early to middle adulthood. The identity that was constructed, however limiting, however much a product of incomplete information and survival necessity rather than authentic choice, calcifies into something that feels absolute and real and simply who I am. And defending that identity, maintaining its continuity and coherence, becomes one of the dominant organizing imperatives of a person's psychological life. This is why change is so threatening. Not because change is objectively dangerous, but because real change, fundamental change, the kind that reaches all the way down to the roots of the operating identity, feels, to the nervous system and to the psychological apparatus that has organized itself around a particular self-concept. Like annihilation, the old identity system doesn't experience the prospect of its own dissolution as liberation. It experiences it as death, because from inside the identity, there is no distinguishing between the constructed self dissolving and something more essential dying. They feel the same. And the system that is in charge of keeping you alive will fight dissolution with everything available to it: rationalization, distraction, depression, anxiety, sudden compelling interest in anything that will pull your attention away from the disintegrating edge. This is the resistance you felt, the pullback at the threshold, the sudden floods of doubt right at the moments of potential breakthrough. The mind that generates elaborate arguments for why this isn't real, why it won't work, why you specifically are the exception to all of this, why you should probably go back to what's familiar because at least that's reliable. That resistance is not evidence that you're wrong. That resistance is evidence that the process is working, because what dissolves in genuine transformation is not you, it is the constructed overlay that you've been mistaking for you, the story self, the survival self, the self that was assembled out of necessity in conditions that no longer exist, to navigate threats that are no longer present according to rules that were always someone else's rules to begin with. What is emerging right now in you beneath and through the dissolution of the old identity structure is something that was always there, something that existed before the construction project began. Something that has been watching patiently from behind the persona, behind the programming, behind the carefully maintained self-concept, waiting for exactly this moment when enough of the overlay has dissolved for it to be not just felt but recognized. This is what the mystics across every tradition have always been pointing toward, what the psychologists now cautiously approach from the direction of research, what the quantum physicists describe in the language of observer and observed, the consciousness that underlies personality, the awareness that holds experience without being identical to any particular experience, the you that is doing the observing of you, the witness, the deeper self, the essential nature that the Buddhists call Buddha nature and the Christians call the soul and the psychologists call the self with a capital S, and the neuroscientists are beginning to map as the default mode network in its deepest integration state. You are disconnecting from the former identity. This is not loss, though it can feel like loss, and those feelings deserve acknowledgement and compassion. It is more precisely described as clarification, like the moment when fog lifts and what was always there, the landscape, the hills, the sky, becomes visible not because it has newly arrived, but because what was obscuring it has finally cleared. The disconnection has a particular quality. If you've been feeling it, you know exactly what I mean. It's a sense of watching your old reactions from a slight distance. They still arise, but there's a new space between the arising and the identifying. You can see the old pattern as a pattern rather than as reality. You can feel the old emotion as a visitation rather than as who you are. The former identity still makes its appearances, but you are less convinced by it, less merged with it, less willing to reorganize your entire experience of reality around its particular version of what's true. This is what psychological non-attachment actually means in practice, not the forced suppression of feeling or caring, not the cold withdrawal from engagement with life, but the natural, organic capacity to experience your experience without being tyrannized by it, to feel the feeling without the feeling being the final word. To have a thought without the thought constituting a complete description of reality. The former identity is becoming something you have rather than something you are. And what you actually are, what is emerging into the space created by that distinction, is something larger, quieter, more capable, and more genuinely free than the constructed self ever managed to be. Because it doesn't need to defend itself, because it isn't built on conditions that could be threatened, because its foundation is not the accumulated story of what happened to you, but something much older and much more stable than any story. The disconnection is happening. It cannot be undone now. The former identity is becoming a past tense thing, still present in memory, still operational in residual patterns that will continue to dissolve, but no longer the sovereign authority over who you are and how you engage with your life. What you are becoming has always been what you actually are. 6. The stabilization of the new state. Transformation, in popular understanding, is often portrayed as an event, a moment of awakening, a dramatic before and after, a rupture in the linear story of your life where everything suddenly and completely changes and you emerge fully, permanently, immediately into the new version. This is not how it works. And understanding how it actually works is not a diminishment of the reality of what you're experiencing. It is the difference between navigating the actual terrain and stumbling through it using a map of a different place. What actually follows the initial shift, the threshold crossing, the identity dissolution, the timeline split, is a period of integration and stabilization, and this period is, in many ways, the most important part of the entire process. Because transformation that doesn't stabilize doesn't last. It remains an experience, profound, memorable, real, but it doesn't become a foundation, it doesn't become the new default. And the old pattern, which never fully disappears but simply loses operational dominance, finds its way back in through the gap between the peak experience and the failure to ground it into daily reality. The stabilization of the new state is not glamorous. It doesn't have the dramatic emotional intensity of the initial breakthrough. It doesn't feel like expansion in the same breathtaking way. What it feels like is something more like arriving home, a quiet recognition that this new way of being is becoming ordinary. It is becoming natural, is beginning to feel less like an elevated state you're visiting and more like the stable ground you're standing on. Let's talk about what stabilization actually involves at the neurological level, because this is where the process either succeeds or remains incomplete. When a new neural pathway forms, when a new way of thinking, feeling, or responding is activated for the first time or the early times, it exists initially as a thin, lightly myelinated thread. It's real, the pathway is genuinely there, but it's fragile. Temporary interference from the old, thick, heavily myelinated pathways can easily overwhelm it. A high-stress moment, a familiar trigger, a return to an old environment or old relationship dynamic, any of these can activate the old superhighway and temporarily drown out the new, quieter signal. This is why people make genuine breakthroughs and then seem to regress. Why can someone have a real, authentic, undeniable experience of a new state of being and then find themselves, a week later, behaving in ways that seem completely inconsistent with that experience? This is not failure. This is not evidence that the transformation wasn't real. This is the physics of neurological change. The new pathway encountering the interference of the old one before it's developed sufficient strength to hold its signal through the noise. The stabilization process is the process of building that strength, of activating the new pathway repeatedly, consistently, in varied contexts and circumstances, until the myelin thickens sufficiently that the new way of being can hold its signal even in the presence of triggers that would previously have activated the old pattern instantly and completely. This requires something very specific from you, and it is not the dramatic effort that the word requires might suggest. What it requires is consistency without perfectionism. Returning to the new state not because you've maintained it perfectly, but because you've noticed you've drifted and you know how to come back. Not condemning yourself for the drift. The drift is neurologically normal and expected, but also not using it as evidence that the transformation isn't real or that you're fundamentally broken. The drift is the old pathway asserting its residual strength. The return is the new pathway building strength against it. Both are necessary parts of the process. Think of it in terms of physical training. You don't stabilize a new physical capacity by doing the exercise once perfectly in ideal conditions and then never doing it again. You stabilize it through repeated engagement that gradually builds the underlying physical infrastructure, stronger muscles, better neural-muscular coordination, improved cardiovascular capacity, until the new level of performance becomes your baseline rather than your peak. The same principle applies completely to psychological and neurological transformation. What does this look like in practice? It looks like becoming a student of your own inner state. Developing the habit, not the effortful, disciplined, white-knuckle variety of habit, but the natural, interested, curious variety of periodically checking in with yourself throughout the day. Where am I operating from right now? The old frequency or the new one? The contracted, defensive, scarcity-oriented state, or the expanded, open, possibility-oriented one? And when the answer is the old one, which it will sometimes be because you're in a stabilization process, not a completed one. What's the shortest path back? Because you know the path back now. That's what has changed. The new state is familiar enough, has been visited enough, inhabited enough, returned to enough, that it's accessible. You don't have to find it from scratch every time. You know how it feels. You know what thoughts accompany it. You know what body posture, what breathing pattern, what quality of attention allows it to arise with the least friction. This is stabilization. The new state became accessible rather than rare, becoming the reliable option rather than the occasional miracle. There is also a social dimension to stabilization that deserves direct attention because it is often the most challenging and the most overlooked aspect of the process. When you change, genuinely fundamentally at the level we've been discussing, the people in your life who have known the old version of you will respond to that change in ways that range from quietly supportive to actively destabilizing. This is not because they are malicious. It is because human social systems, families, friendships, communities, workplaces, develop homeostatic mechanisms, just like biological systems. They develop a set point for each member's behavior, emotional range, and self-presentation. And when a member begins deviating significantly from their established set point, the system generates pressure, often unconsciously, often with genuine love and concern, to return that member to their familiar position. You seem different lately. Are you okay? I'm not sure this new you is really you. Don't you think you're being a bit extreme? I miss who you used to be. These responses, and the subtler versions of them, the small social pressures and implicit expectations that don't even make it into words, can be among the most powerful forces acting against stabilization, because they activate the identity-level anxiety we talked about in the previous section, the sense that changing means losing your belonging, losing your place in the system that knows you and holds you. The stabilization of the new state requires learning to receive this social pressure without being capsized by it. Not by hardening against it, not by cutting off the relationships that generate it, though some relationships may naturally evolve or dissolve as you do, and this is a normal part of the process, but by developing a stable enough relationship with your own emerging identity that you don't need external validation to maintain it, by becoming your own reliable witness, your own consistent confirmer of what's real. This is the deepest aspect of stabilization, the point at which the new state no longer depends on favorable external conditions to maintain itself. When it can hold steady even in the presence of triggers, even under social pressure, even in the return to old environments, even in the inevitable difficult days when everything old feels more real than everything new, that kind of stability is not achieved overnight, but it is being achieved. And every day that you return to the new state, from whatever distance you drifted, you are contributing to the structural integrity of the foundation you are building. The new state is stabilizing, quietly, steadily, with increasing permanence. 7. Why you can't fully go back anymore. There is a particular quality to the awareness you're carrying right now, a quality that marks it as unmistakably different from any previous moment of insight, inspiration, or temporary elevation you've experienced. Previous insights came and went. You've had moments of clarity before, moments where you could see yourself and your patterns with unusual precision, where something opened and you felt genuinely like you were standing in a different relationship to your life. And then those moments passed. The old gravity reasserted itself, the familiar returned, and the insight became a memory, real but historical, something that had happened rather than something that was continuing to happen. This is different, and the reason it's different is not a matter of intensity or depth or how dramatically it arrived. It's a matter of the specific mechanism by which awareness operates once it has crossed a certain threshold. There is a principle in consciousness that is so simple it can sound trivial, but whose implications are radical when fully absorbed. You cannot fully return to unconsciousness about something you have genuinely become conscious of. Not permanently, not completely, not in any way that would re-establish the same quality of automatic, effortless, invisible operation that the old pattern enjoyed before you saw through it. Think about one of the simplest versions of this principle in ordinary experience. before you learned something about how a particular manipulation tactic works, say the way certain people use guilt to create compliance, or the way certain arguments are structured to sound logical while being fundamentally dishonest, that tactic worked on you smoothly and invisibly. You didn't notice it happening, you just found yourself feeling guilty or convinced without quite knowing why. The tactic operated below your threshold of perception, and then you learned about it. Someone explained how it works, you recognized the pattern, named it, and understood its mechanism, and from that moment, you cannot go back. Not fully. The next time that tactic is deployed in your direction, you may still feel the pull of it. Some residual response may still arise, but you are never again completely unaware of what's happening. The recognition always arrives, maybe a beat later than you'd like, maybe after you've partially responded to it, but it arrives, and its arrival changes everything about what you do next. This is the one-way door of genuine awareness. Once you're on the other side of it, the only way through is forward. What you have become genuinely conscious of, what has crossed from invisible background assumption to visible foreground object of awareness, goes far beyond a single manipulation tactic. It is the entire architecture of your former way of being. The operating system, the pattern system, the constructed identity, and the fear-based logic that has been running it. You have seen through the mechanism at a level that makes the mechanism genuinely unable to regain its former transparency. It can still run. Residual patterns are tenacious things, and dissolution takes time, but it can no longer run invisibly. Every time it activates now, some part of you recognizes it. Name it, observe it from outside rather than being absorbed into it. And that observing perspective, that tiny but invincible gap between the arising of the old pattern and the self that watches it arise, is the permanent change. The one-way door. There is also a somatic dimension to this irreversibility, a dimension that lives in the body rather than in the cognitive mind, and that may be the most reliable confirmation that genuine transformation, rather than temporary elevation, is what's occurring. Your body knows where it's been. More precisely, your body holds the signature of every state you've inhabited with any significant frequency or intensity. The musculature, the posture, the breathing patterns, the nervous system's baseline activation level, the felt sense of what normal feels like from the inside. All of these are not fixed constants but dynamic states that are shaped by the states you most habitually inhabit. When you spend extended time in a contracted, fear-based, compressed state, and when you then spend extended time in an expanded, open, possibility-oriented state, your body learns the difference between them in a way that is deeper than cognitive knowledge. It develops a somatic memory, a body knowing, and once the body knows what expansion actually feels like from the inside, not as an idea, not as a description, but as a direct somatic experience, it retains that knowledge. It can recognize the difference between the two states instantly, below the threshold of rational thought. This is why, as the shift stabilizes, you will find that the return of old contracted states is no longer entirely smooth. The body now has a reference point that it didn't previously have, and it registers the contraction not just as a neutral state but as a state of diminishment relative to the expansion it now knows is possible. The old state doesn't just feel familiar, it starts to feel confining, wrong, too small, like trying to squeeze back into a space you've physically grown out of. This is not imagined discomfort. This is the body's genuine recognition that the former state no longer fits the person inhabiting it, and that discomfort is, paradoxically, one of the most reliable signs that real change has occurred. The old state used to feel like home. Now it feels like visiting someone else's home, familiar in some surface ways but fundamentally not yours. There is also a relational dimension of irreversibility that operates in interesting and sometimes surprising ways. The people in your life who have known you through periods of your growth, who have witnessed you in the process of this change, even if they couldn't name what they were witnessing, have formed updated models of who you are. They have begun, however tentatively, to relate to a new version of you, And relationships, once updated, are very difficult to meaningfully downgrade. The people who have seen you show up differently, more clear, more direct, more genuinely present, less reactive, less confined by the old defenses, cannot entirely unsee that. The old version of you, were you to attempt to resurrect it, would ring false in a social system that has already begun to adjust to the new. There is also one more layer of irreversibility, perhaps the deepest one, and it has to do with meaning. Human beings are meaning-making creatures above all else. We can tolerate almost any external circumstance if we have a meaningful framework for understanding it. We will almost inevitably struggle with even objectively favorable circumstances if we can't make meaning of them. And one of the most powerful forms of meaning, one of the things that most completely transforms a person's relationship to their own existence, is the experience of understanding what you've been through in a way that reveals its purpose. You are in the process of making meaning of your entire history in a new way. The patterns that confined you for so long, they are beginning to reveal their role, not as punishments, not as evidence of your deficiency, not as cruel accidents, but as the precise conditions that created the specific form of growth you were capable of, at the specific time you were capable of it, as the exact pressure that produced the particular clarity you're now carrying. This meaning, once made, once genuinely internalized, is perhaps the most irreversible of all the changes occurring, because it transforms the entire relationship between you and your past. The past that seemed like something to escape from, something to overcome, something that explained your limitations, it becomes the foundation of your wisdom, the specific curriculum of your becoming, the precise preparation for the version of your life that lies ahead of this moment. Going back would not just be uncomfortable, not just neurologically challenging, not just socially awkward. It would be meaningless. It would be a betrayal of what you now understand your entire journey to have been preparing you for. You can't go back fully, not because the door is locked from the outside, but because the version of you that would find the old life satisfying, familiar, and home no longer exists with sufficient coherence to inhabit it. The forward direction is not a choice anymore. It is what you are. You see it, not as an idea, not as something you're trying to believe, but as something you've already stepped into, because the shift was never waiting for your permission. It was waiting for your alignment. And the moment that alignment happened, everything began to move in a different direction. Quietly, precisely, without needing confirmation. This is why things no longer feel the same, why your reactions are changing, why your perspective is no longer tied to what used to control you. You didn't force this. You reached the point where it became inevitable. And from here, there is no real way to return to the version of you that existed before this moment, because that version no longer fits the reality you're now aligned with. So don't question it. Don't try to analyze it. Just recognize it, because this wasn't just a shift you experienced. This is the moment everything truly changed.